Good morning. Good morning. And welcome. I'm David, as you, I think, all know. And I am really excited about starting in on the second prophecy of Isaiah, the second half of the book of the prophet Isaiah. This is going to be, in some ways, a parallel with what we did last Lent. That a year ago we were tackling the difficult story of Job, many chapters full of theology and poetry, full of questions, and that was a wonderful study. I'm glad we did it. Second Isaiah is from a period in history that is parallel to the period that Job is written in, but it has a completely different message and a completely different point of view. So I think it will be a great compliment to our reading of Job. So we're going to be reading the second part of the book of Isaiah, and it takes its place in religion as a writing of a prophet. So there are stories of prophets in the Old Testament. Elijah and Elisha and Samuel are some of the prophets that are named there. And they don't get books to themselves. They are given narrative space in the story of ancient Israel. So in the books of Kings and Chronicles and Samuel, we have the stories of the words, but also of the deeds of these early prophets. And then we have some books where it's given over completely to prophets. So we have a few really big books, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Lamentations, which is by Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So we have a few really big books, and Isaiah is probably arguably the most important of these. I think you're going to really love what we're about to read. So those are called the major prophets, and they are prophets whose writings are contained in these books, and very little, if anything, about who that person was and when they spoke and all that kind of thing. So it's not the historical narration, but it's the actual contents of the prophecy of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel that are in their big books. And then there are 12 minor prophets that you probably have heard of, like, can anybody throw out some names? Minor prophets?
Habakkuk.
Amos is one, Habakkuk is one, Malachi is one, Hosea is one. These are good names to know. Nahum, Zephaniah, Zechariah, do you know these names? All right, so they're the little tiny books that are toward the back of the Old Testament, right? And there are 12 of these minor prophets, and their prophecy books might be 3 chapters, 6 chapters. They would make, even the 12 minor prophets altogether would not make a Lenten study because they're so short and brief and specific in their concerns and what they're dealing with. Not that they're not worthy of deep study, they are. But each of the minor prophets has one point, makes it, and gets out of the way. The major prophets have layered points, and they make them over and over again in beautiful and different ways. And that means that they have a rich offering for us to be reading and to be studying. The major prophets in Isaiah is what we're going to do. So among religion and prophecy, we have Isaiah located as a big chunk. But also among the literature of the Old Testament. When you think of the Old Testament containing literary monuments, the real beauties of ancient literature, we have Psalms, of course, we have Proverbs, we have Job that we read last year. Remember how very literary that work was? It really was more like reading a novel with theological undertones than reading the Bible. And we have major parts of the prophet Isaiah that are pure poetry, inspirational, beautiful poetry. So this reading is going to have not only its element of what does God have to say to God's people for this time, which is what a prophet does, but also what do God's people have to say about God and to each other, which is religious writing, literature, and poetry. Now, Hebrew poetry, as we learned last year, is not like our English language poetry. It's not going to rhyme unless the translator has made an effort to add rhyming to Hebrew. Hebrew, rather than using rhyming, would sometimes use alliteration, so having a lot of words that start with the same sound. More often would use wordplay. And this is easy to do in Hebrew and Arabic and other Semitic languages, because in the Semitic languages, you have a set of letters like M-Y-M, right? Which is just 3 consonant sounds, million. And that word can mean water. But because it doesn't have any vowels in it, you don't know whether it's a noun or an adverb or an adjective, or if it's a verb, you don't know whether it's past tense or future tense, present tense, plural, singular, because the same 3 consonants just mean water and anything to do with water, right? So then when you add vowels in and around it, it might say, he will water, or there are waters, or whatever you might have. So that you could see how in a language as economical as Arabic and Hebrew, the Semitic languages are, with those 3-letter roots called trigraphs, that you can really have fun as a poet, because you can start changing only the middle letter. You can have an NYM and an MZM and an MDM. You can have a DBR and a DRR and a DZR. And you see how you start to get a rhythm going with the words that you choose. You're not going to be able to appreciate that, but I want you to know when you're reading it, and it comes off as free verse, you know, it looks a lot like just modern poetry, where your feeling is the only thing that makes it poetry is that the line ended earlier, right? But otherwise it's not poetic at all. That sense of this isn't really poetry goes away when you understand that it's a translation, and it's a translation of something that uses different ways of making poetry work. Now, all poetry of the ancients, and a lot of modern poetry, is built on a down-up model. This is called thesis and arsis in Greek, in theory. But you don't need to know that. Downbeat, you understand, and upbeat, you understand. And the alternation of down and upbeat is weight and weightlessness, heaviness and lightness. So we have an on verse and an off verse. And in most of your Bible publications, it's going to show the on and off verse by starting at the margin and indented, the margin and indented, okay? And then within the verse, there's a structure to it as well, which is, I'm going to say something, I'm going to say it again. The Lord is gracious and full of mercy. You see, I just said the same thing twice. Once on the downbeat, once on the upbeat. That becomes an essential part of the structure of Hebrew poetry. Now if I say, the Lord is gracious and full of mercy, slow to anger, now I'm still saying the same thing again, and then I have my offbeat, so that now my ideas are grouping into pairs. I'm saying the same thing, and exactly the same thing. A complementary thing, and exactly the same complementary thing. That's the structure of a 2-foot verse, and there are 3-foot verses. So when you're reading your Isaiah, if you're reading from a Bible that has verse numbers, you'll notice verse 23, and there might be on the margin, off the margin, on the margin, off the margin. That would be a standard verse. What you have to expect then is that it says something, and then it says a variation on that thing. And each is repeated. So you can have a 2-foot verse or a 3-foot verse. That's going to be what you're going to see for poetic structure. Okay. Where have we been in our Bible reads so far now? Who's been doing every one of these Bible reads? Some of you have. What have we read? What did we start with? The book of James. Can you give us in 2 sentences, Gina, what is the book of James?
It's a very good guideline in your life. That's all.
Guideline of how to live your life. Yes, and for the individual, but very importantly in the book of James for the church, for the community of the church. The book of James is a how to live. How are we going to live as Christians? Okay, so after James, what did we read? Anyone remember?
We read Joseph.
Before Joseph, before Joseph, a little story from the New Testament. from the book of Acts. Does anybody remember Stephen? The stoning of Stephen. Right. We read about Stephen. What was Stephen's place in our unfolding of this story? Does anybody remember we'll just recap a little bit where we've been. The first martyr. And particularly martyred for what? What did he do? How did Stephen offend people enough to get killed? Anybody remember? Nobody remember? Oh, we gotta go back and read it.
Did he defend
He defended his faith and his faith in Jesus, right? So a Christian martyr, in other words, there's a lot of people got killed for different reasons at the time, but he becomes the first Christian martyr because he's the first person condemned to death for confessing his faith in Jesus. Okay, that's the importance of Stephen. Then we came to the book of Joseph. Where is the story of Joseph contained? Does anybody remember which book of the Bible Joseph was? The last 13 chapters of Genesis. Joseph concludes Genesis, okay? So the last 13 chapters of Genesis, we read the story of Joseph, and it isn't just that Technicolor raincoat. It isn't just that he has this coat of many colors, but Joseph has an important message for us in terms of God's love and God's intention for people to live together in family the way they should. So his whole story, his interaction with his father, his brothers, etc., is the key to Joseph. Then we read the book of Job a year ago. Anybody can summarize for me what the book of Job was about? Complaining. This is very important. Complaining. Job and Jeremiah give us the two best books in the Bible for people who want a biblical underpinning for their complaining. Job and Jeremiah do nothing but complain. And that's wonderful. And it's wonderful because it frees us up. Remember, reading the book of Job freed us up to be angry with God, to call God into question. It freed us up to fully experience a human relationship between ourselves and our faith and a living God, because that's exactly what happens in Job. And if we were to read Jeremiah, that's also what would happen there. In the fall, we read Mark. Now, hopefully some of you are ready to talk about that. Sandy, at the end of Mark, you said it was a benefit to you to read it all at once. In other words, not to read it just a little fraction of it on a Sunday morning and preaching on it, that's fine. And one half of a verse in Bible study on Wednesday morning and study it closely, that's fine. But reading the whole book from beginning to end was a revelation. And is there at any point to the book of Mark that you could summarize? Somebody said, what was that about reading Mark? Anybody want to tell me what was reading Mark?
It was that Jesus was the Son of God.
That Jesus was the Son of God. So you see that evangelical Jesus is the Son of God as from the first sentence being what Mark is trying to get across. And so he gets it across, right? And he got it across, if you remember in Mark, with economy of storytelling. He didn't put a lot of extra words in. He went zipping from one thing to another, and then he gave lots of examples of what Jesus did more often than of what Jesus said. Right? So there are other gospels that we get to later on that might talk about what Jesus said a little bit more. All right, and now we're just about to put Isaiah into that mix. And particularly we're going to be putting 2nd Isaiah into the mix. Now, to understand who 2nd Isaiah is, you have to get a little bit of history, and we've done this before, but in the beginning of salvation history, there's stories in the Old Testament when God related to people just like another Joe, right? For example, here's God walking around, and who is God talking to? Adam. And Eve. God is talking to Adam and Eve. And there is no concept in the stories at the beginning of the book of Genesis, the beginning of the Bible, there's no concept that God is some different thing. That there is God, the creator of everything, and there is nobody struggling with him. There is nobody denying, there is no other way of being. There's nobody worshiping false gods. Because there's just, here's Adam, here's Eve, here's the garden, here's God. Okay? And that continues through until we get a story in the 6th to the 9th chapter of Genesis, which is the story of a righteous man
Not yet Abraham. We have 3.5 chapters devoted to Noah. So the story of Noah is the next one in this lineage, even though there are people like Cain and Abel and Tubal and Jubal that come in between, all the smaller names. The next big name in the Bible that gets his own 3.5 chapters is Noah. And the reason that Noah is remembered is for not only that he was a righteous man and that he built the ark and took the animals away in it, but that at the end of the story, there is a covenant that's made. So now it's the beginning of a relational understanding of humanity and God. That God makes a deal with Noah. And does anybody remember the deal? The rainbow is the sign of this covenant. I will never destroy the world again. I will never try to destroy the world again by water. Okay, maybe by fire later on. But okay, so there's a covenant, a relationship thing that happens. So we started out with just God is walking in the garden with Adam and Eve. And then we've got God is above the firmament, making a bargain, a deal with Noah. Then comes the next name that we heard there, which is Abraham. Okay, and Abraham's children are important too. So Abraham's son is Isaac, and then Isaac's son is Jacob, right? So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That 3 generations take up with Joseph then, who is Jacob's son, the rest of Genesis. Right away through to chapter 40 of Genesis is the story of Abraham and his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So again, we have a covenant. That's the basic idea. That Abraham is engaged in a relationship with God where God says, I will be your God and you will be my people. And I will make this covenant with you. Now there's a sign of that covenant, which is the sign of the covenant with Abraham. Because, yes, it's circumcision. So in the New Testament, when Paul is going on and on about do Christians still need to circumcise their male children, he's talking about if we are children of Abraham, are we not bound by the same rules as Abraham? And if not, then why not? So that's the Abraham part of the story. Now, Abraham's children, and they're living here and they're wandering there, but they end up in Egypt, and that's a big part of the story of Joseph as they get to Egypt. Now they're in Egypt, and somebody comes along 100 years later and says, let's get out here. Who is that? That's Moses. Everybody knows Moses. Good. This is crazy. So Moses comes along and says, let my people go. Let us out here. Pharaoh. Okay, so when Moses takes the people of Israel, they wander in the Sinai. They get the 10 Commandments from the Mount Sinai, and Moses has that theophany, which means God appears to Moses. So see how very different it is. We had here God walking and talking with Adam and Eve in the garden. Then we have God choosing, talking, interacting, negotiating with Noah. And now we've got God with Abraham saying, no, go and do this. Go and sacrifice your son, for example. And now we've got God appears to Moses, and his face looks like he's been burned under a sun lamp. And this is a unique event. The theophany on the mountain for Moses is unique, whereas for Adam and Eve it was every day we wake up and hi God, there's God. So do you see what's happened is in the course of just that one book of Genesis and then into Exodus with the beginning of the story of Moses, we have seen the presence of God retreating. Now this is going to become very important because the way that we interact with God in these stories is through that presence. How do we feel that presence? So Moses leads the people into the promised land. They kill everybody in the promised land. Now, everything before that point is the age of the patriarchs. So if I ever talk in here about patriarchs, I'm talking about over there. Now, when I talk about the age after they get into Canaan, the promised land, I'm talking about the age of judges. Now, the judges is one of the most obscure and unknown for one very basic reason. It's full of names that you can't pronounce. You know when you get assigned to do the reading in church on a Sunday morning, and you say, I don't want to do that one, then that's going to be probably dealing with this age, because the judges are all given these obscure names, and the places they're ruling in and the cities are all obscure names, and you've got enough with Hezekiah and Jehoshaphat. Those are the easy names. Okay. So there are a couple of stories that come from the time of the judges that we remember very fondly, and that would be, for example, Samson and Delilah is one of the stories from that period. So we have the nation of Israel organized in its 12 tribes because of the 12 children. Each one has a tribe of their children and their servants and their animals and so on. And the 12 tribes each take up residence in a different part of the Promised Land. Eventually, they start to get organized under more and more powerful governments of judges becoming kings, and they finally become monarchies. And the monarchies are twofold. There's one in the north and one in the south. Does anybody remember the names of the north and the south? Because this is Israel and Judah. So Israel is the northern half, Judah is the southern half. Okay. The two sets of kings go on until there is a unifying monarch, who is David. So David, who succeeds Saul as the king of Judah. Saul is the king of Judah, and David is anointed to succeed him. Unifies the north and south kingdoms into one monarchy, and that's King David's realm. His son Solomon, and during Solomon's reign, actually, it divides again into north and south. So it's a very brief period. And the timeline, I love the simplicity of this. I always come back to it. Moses is 1250 BC, and King David is 1000 BC. Okay, so very easy numbers to remember. 1250 for Moses, and 250 years later, the unified monarchy, King David is 1000. So after that unification, over the next 200 years, there is a rising power, and that power is in the northeast of the Promised Land, and that power is Assyria. So Assyria is centered at Nineveh, and Nineveh is Mosul. All right? So when you hear about somebody is stationed at Mosul in northern Iraq, that's Nineveh. That's Assyria. It's exactly the same. Right across the river is the ruins of Nineveh and the town of Mosul. So this is very much in the news right now, is this area between the two rivers, the Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The northern part of that is Assyria. And the Assyrians start to take over the whole territory bit by bit by bit. And the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel, they make a decision that they are going to try and appease. They make an appeasement policy to the Assyrians. But the Assyrians are really interested in just taking over. And the way that they take over is very similar to, on Star Trek, the Borg. So on the Borg is these alien species on Star Trek that they say, you will be assimilated. You will be assimilated. And what they do is that wherever they go, they take the whole culture and the whole planet and all its energies and resources, and they assimilate it into the collective. So that's the way the Assyrian Empire worked, is that they simply came in and they made you Assyrian. That means that the Jews who were living and worshiping in the northern kingdom, once Assyria came over and took over, which is 721 BC, they became mixed in their genetic makeup because of forced marriages. That was part of the way Assyria did its job. They became mixed in their religious practices because that was part of the way Assyria did its job. Assyria had an interest in mushing everybody, sort of melting pot, right? Or stew that's been on the oven for too long, on the stove for too long, that it just turned into just mush. And nobody had their distinctiveness anymore. So if you think about in modern Europe, all of the conflict about the euro, a huge part of the euro conflict has nothing to do with finances, but it has to do with national identity. It has to do with who are we? We're the people who spend francs, not the people who spend euros. We're the people who spend drachmas, not the people who spend euros. And so how do you renegotiate your national identity when you're trying to also have a group of nations functioning together? In the early American history, the same thing happened with our money. You know, we used to have currency state by state instead of national currency. So, so that whole idea of how much of my culture can I give over to a larger enterprise? In terms of religion, I mentioned, God in the place of God. The Jewish cult became unique at about this time. In other words, up until then, it was something between us Hebrews and our God. We do this, there's God. We take care of each other, we're all good. Once this Assyrian power comes in and says, yes, your God is wonderful, and don't forget to set up a statue of our gods. And you can have both. That's when the Hebrews started to engage in a struggle. What does it really mean to be Jewish? How do we define it? And so a lot of the fine-tuning of the law, like exactly what do we do, what do we not do, starts to happen precisely because of that interaction with the Assyrian culture. If the Assyrians hadn't come in, the Hebrews would have gone on jauntily walking with God, no problem. But now all of a sudden they had to define who is our God versus who is your God. You get that distinction I'm talking about? So, for example, a lot of people who didn't feel challenged about their Christianity and their Christian faith before the last, say, 10 years focus on Islam, and maybe the last 2 years focus on Mormonism or whatever, a lot of people didn't have to think too much about it. I'm Christian, da-da-da, that's it. But now they have to define, am I that kind of Christian? Am I that kind of Christian? Is my one God, if I have one God and you have one God, are our one God's the same one God? And that kind of dialogue starts happening. So that kind of dialogue informs that the nation after the fall of the north to Assyria. So that is first Isaiah. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah, which we are not going to be reading, are, what is the phrase? The prophet's job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, right? So the first 39 chapters of Isaiah is the Isaiah who lives in Jerusalem, hollering as loud as he can, be faithful, be true, or else doom will come your way. So the first 39 chapters are full of darkness and full of doom because he's talking to a comfortable nation that is under stress, under attack from Assyria. So this Isaiah is called by God, we call him first Isaiah, is called by God in the final year of the reign of King Uzziah. And that Isaiah lives in about 740 as the year of his calling to about 700 BC. So he's an active prophet for those, say, 40, 45 years leading up to about 700 BC. Well, when the Assyrians come and capture the north is 721 BC. So Isaiah is functioning right at that time when he's saying to the nation, you better shape up or somebody's going to come sent by God to destroy you and take you captive. And then that happens. That's first Isaiah. We're not going to read him. Some other day. We are going to read second Isaiah. So now Isaiah is in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the capital of Judah, the southern kingdom. And Isaiah's school, his disciples and followers and so on, remain active. And the southern kingdom starts to be under duress from not the northeast, which is Assyria, but from the southeast, which is Babylonia and Babylon. And eventually a power rises there that takes over not only Assyria, but takes over the whole region, and that is King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now, where's Babylon? Babylon is 50 miles south of Baghdad, southern Iraq. Okay, so we're literally talking about Iraq. Northern Iraq is Assyria, southern Iraq is Babylonia, and one after the other takes the northern kingdom away, and then Babylonia comes and takes the southern kingdom away. There are three deportations and destructions that happen in a row: 597, 587, 582 BC. So between 597 BC and 582 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar and his armies come into Judah and Jerusalem and take away a bunch of people, destroy the temple, and make a wasteland where once was this active and busy city. So now the people of Israel are in exile. They are all taken to Babylon. And in Babylon, they begin to try to form an identity as a community. Now you can see already what would happen if you take a group of people into exile, that they have all of a sudden a different way of relating to their homeland. And we're going to talk a lot about that exile community. Second Isaiah, the book that we're about to start on, is written in and for that community. It is written for the kingdom of Judah, destroyed, captive, homeless. And what word does second Isaiah have to give them? To comfort the afflicted and to offer them word of hope. So the community is all through this book given two things. The first is a sense of identity. Who are we in exile? Who are we when we don't have a home to remind us of who we are? And what will we be when we can return home? Now, there's a reason why Second Isaiah has the flavor that it has, and that is that it is written when the changes in the air. Okay, has anybody heard the phrase "rich as Croesus"? Okay, so Croesus is this legendary wealthy king of Lydia, which is Western Turkey, Asia Minor, and Cyrus is the king of a Persian state, and Cyrus decides that he's going to take over the world. First thing he does is he overthrows his own grandfather's kingdom that he is a vassal state of. So his own grandfather is the king in the north, the Median king in Media, and he is the king in the south, in Persia, which is modern-day Iran. Okay, so now we're in Iran. So the first thing he does overthrows his grandfather's dynasty, and then taking all of the arms and the men from both of his kingdoms, heads west and takes over Croesus and Lydia. Now he has not only all this territory, which is making a great arch around Israel, and Babylon, more importantly, but he has all the gold from Lydia. So rich as Croesus is important. Croesus had this tons and tons of gold from his gold mines. And now Cyrus has all of that captured in his war. So now he has unlimited ability to just conquer the whole area, and he goes ahead and does that. During the period when Second Isaiah is written, Cyrus is doing that. And Second Isaiah is going to refer to Cyrus by name and say, the Lord has raised up from the east, talking about Persia, one who is going to change the course of events, one who's going to set you free. And Isaiah makes it very clear, this is not one of us. The Lord is not functioning through a Moses who's one of the chosen people hidden among the Egyptians. But the Lord is going to function through a new Moses who is going to lead you home anyway, who's going to lead you out of your exile anyway, but who is not a believer in the Lord. That's going to open up for Second Isaiah all kinds of questions about where's the limit on the benefits of God. So you see, we're starting in this very book to make a transition toward the end of the New Testament, where it isn't, this is my God, this is our God, and this is how we worship our God, but this is the God, just the God of Cyrus and the God of Nebuchadnezzar. It's just that Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar don't know that's the God, but still. So there's a transition that's going to happen theologically in the course of this book. Let me see, I wanted to say, that one of the most important things in reading 2nd Isaiah is to remember that the community that it's addressed to, Jacob, Israel, is completely powerless politically. There's no longer a monarchy, there's no longer a king, there's no governance, there's no organization to that community. So he is speaking to a disheartened, homeless, powerless, politically inert group about you will go home, you will have a place. And a lot of my thinking in leading up to this morning was to focus on the ideas that came out of my visit to Cuba. It's not exactly parallel, but there are some strong parallels. When you think about it, when the Castro struggle with the Batista regime was going on, right, you had a previous and then you had a future regime. And out of that turmoil, out of that struggle, a number of Cubans came away from Cuba. Many of them thought temporarily, right? Some of them still think temporarily, okay? When you start to investigate what happens when there's an end to the current regime in Cuba, and the people who've been living in exile for 60 years go back and say, but this is my house, to people who've lived in that house for 65 years. Can you imagine what's going to happen? Who left when the Castro regime took over was very often the wealthy class, the merchant class, the industrial class. And who's going to go back there is people who are used to having power, authority, property, etc. are going to go back and say, ah. Who stayed was people who were powerless to do any other, but in the meanwhile have been the ones who suffered in this place with this land and so on. Can you see that we're setting up some tensions? that at some point in the future there's going to be some kind of disasters. But this is not the future yet. This is a meantime. And in the meantime, Cubans in America have to figure out, who are we? What makes us Cuban? To what degree are we American? If things change, do we go back or do we stay here? Or do we try to put one foot in each? How do we think about and talk about our homeland? Do we talk about it in the past? Do we talk about only its beauties? Do we talk about its future? What are our songs? And 2nd Isaiah is, in some way, Israel's version of that, Cuban music. Cuban culture in Florida. Because 2nd Isaiah is talking about the temple is destroyed, but will be rebuilt. And the last 10 chapters, the temple is being rebuilt because Cyrus has taken over Babylon and has sent the people home. And yet when they come back to Jerusalem and say, here we are, we're here to rebuild the temple, the people who've been living in Jerusalem for the past 60 years say, who invited you back? Who wants your temple? We've gotten along just fine without it. And now we have to pay a temple tax and give you our best gold and melt down our dinnerware so that you can build candlesticks with it? I mean, there's this huge thing that happens. So the last 10 chapters of our reading are exactly that. It's sometimes called 3rd Isaiah, because it's actually the conflicts over who is really Jewish, what is really proper in Jerusalem, so that even the return from exile is not just glory, and is full of complications. In fact, the last 10 chapters are kind of an anticlimax because of exactly that. The first of our reading, the first 15 chapters are, you're going home, it's coming soon, it's going to be great. And then they come home and they have a few problems and a few issues to deal with. All right, so I hope you're looking forward to that. Before I close, I have one more thing. Yes?
Excuse me, when was that written? What year was it?
So that's where I wanted to go, was I didn't talk about Cyrus actually accomplishing what he accomplished, and I knew I wanted to mention that before you get started on the reading. So Cyrus comes in, do you have the date? 546, he conquers Croesus. So 582 was the last deportation to Babylon. And 546, so about 40 years later, he takes over Croesus. In 538, he takes over Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, which is in disorder anyway. And takes it over by the coolest maneuver, because the city is incredibly well protected, and the river Euphrates goes right through the middle of the city. And his soldiers spend days and days and days digging an enormous trench around the city. And people in the city are just looking out from the walls and scratching their heads and going, we don't understand. Why are you building this trench around the city? We have these huge walls. It's impregnable. You don't have any weapons for firing over. Why are you building this trench? And they didn't disturb them at all because they thought it was the stupidest thing in the world that Cyrus's soldiers would do this. And then they diverted the river into the trench and marched into the city in the dry river bed. So you talk about a new Moses and an image of a new Moses. That's how Cyrus took Babylon. Pretty cool, right? And I don't even like history of warfare, but that's pretty cool. So he takes over Babylon, and Cyrus's approach is completely different from the Assyrians. Cyrus's approach was, no, you go home. You worship your gods. You do your thing. You build your town. The first thing he did to the Jews was say, go back to Jerusalem, build it, make it nice. Have a good time. Pay me my taxes. He didn't insist on anything other than tribute payments, and otherwise every one of his states was a client state. So Cyrus had the largest territory ever controlled by one person up until that point in history. And the way he accomplished it was by letting people be who they were in their town, where they were. So that's about 538. Our book of 2nd Isaiah, the chapters 40 to 55, was written sometime between 545, when Cyrus is first starting to be active, and 535, when the Jews are on their way home. So this is one of the books of the Bible we can date very precisely.
Weren't the first chapters written in 7?
Right, exactly. So that's why we call it 1st and 2nd Isaiah. The book is written by a man, Isaiah, the prophet of Jerusalem. That's the first 35 chapters or so. And then his followers, who are the school of Isaiah. In the same way that there are Pauline epistles that are definitely genuinely by Paul, and then there are some that are in the style of Paul and written as though Paul sent them, and so on. So that's the way. The second half of the book is what we're reading is not by the same Isaiah, unless he lived a Methuselah age. So, is that all good? There's bookmarks in the back. They were in the mailing too. If you didn't get a bookmark, make sure you grab one. I have some here, and it's basically a chapter a day starting tomorrow. You're going to love these first 5 chapters. They're just, they read like that. And then the chapters after that, they don't read as easily, but they're shorter. Yes? Yes.
I was interested in what you said about God removing his presence
Yes.
gradually as time went on. And I guess he sent the prophets to take his place.
Yes.
When was that? Who was the last person God enacted with? Person of us?
Well, so if you're Christian, the list of prophets classically ends with John the Baptist and Jesus, so that Jesus becomes the last of the prophets. If you're Muslim, obviously Muhammad comes after that, and so Muhammad becomes the last prophet. If you're Jewish, then Ezra, Nehemiah,